Welcome to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast with Alex Dean and Bryan Cunningham. Here we have a drink, have a laugh, and you just might learn something about our favorite stories from history.
Please visit our website at hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you like the show, please rate us 5 stars and leave a review. Cheers.
Welcome back to Hidden History Happy Hour. As you know, listeners, we have devoted much of 2 recent episodes now to Putin's horror unfolding in Ukraine this winter and spring of 2022. However, there is a few other things going on in the world. And Alex, lest we forget, there is a pandemic though it's seemingly waning as we record this, but it's not anywhere close to being gone from the earth. And we're most fortunate today to have with us the world's expert on what remains, or perhaps what is debatable at this point, the deadliest pandemic in history, the great influenza of 1918-19. John Barry is not only the unrivaled historian of that pandemic and has been the go-to expert on this current COVID-19 pandemic on television, in the New York Times and elsewhere, but John, I am proud to say, is a colleague in a nonprofit I started at the beginning of COVID-19, and I dare say a friend. Welcome, John Barry.
Thanks. Good to be here. And
Welcome, John.
Anyway, I don't know about the expert, but whatever. Thank you for the introduction.
I can see that's great modesty. John, great to have you with us.
Yeah.
False modesty. False modesty.
Well, that's the best kind. We
man.
We live on that in this podcast.
That's our special kind, right?
Well, listeners, as I mentioned, John Barry is the author of The Deadliest Pandemic in History, the Great Influenza of 1918 and 1919. It'll be in the show notes. Please get it. It's a great read, as well as very relevant to the world today. And John, your book provides a great and very accessible to a scientific dunce like me history of the development of science as applied to medicine. In addition to being a great history of the pandemic, Alex is going to tell us about what may be the earliest significant clinical trials, and we'll be very curious to get your thoughts on whether that's true. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much. This is a story that I confess now that enough time has passed. I have from the vaccines minister at the time in the United Kingdom, Lord Bethell, who very proudly told me about it as the UK was seeking to and doing our best to lead the way, or at least do the best we could in vaccinating our population. And the story I want to tell is the story of James Lind, who was the British naval surgeon who pioneered what we claim, at least, gentlemen, to be the first clinical trials that were conducted. And it was on board HMS Salisbury on the 20th of May, 1747. So a very specific date they kicked off. And those times, as you will appreciate, scurvy was a huge threat for navies around the world. Indeed, scurvy caused more deaths amongst British sailors than the French and Spanish forces combined that we were fighting. So we now know, of course, that scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, but vitamins were in 1747 quite unknown. And Lind thought that scurvy was caused by what they called putrefaction of the body, and that putrefaction could potentially be cured through the introduction of acids. He therefore recruited, I don't want to probe the extent to which they were really volunteers, a dozen men. Yeah, so he made sure he had a dozen guys with scurvy for what he called a fair test. And the fair test wasn't, they didn't call it clinical trials then, but that was what he was aiming for. By the way, I don't pretend that it might satisfy modern day requirements of quite what a clinical trial would look like either, and it definitely didn't constitute informed consent. But anyway, without telling them who was getting what, hence blind groups, he allocated 2 men each to each of 6 different daily treatments for a fortnight. And hold on to your hats, guys. The 6 treatments they got were: first group, 1.1 liters of cider. This is a group that did not complain about their allocation.
This would be hard. Alex, am I right? This would be hard cider.
That is hard cider, 1.1 liters a day, that you were obliged to consume as a sailor in the interest of science.
I like it.
The second group, not quite so lucky, 25 milliliters of dilute sulfuric acid.
Oof.
Yep, that's probably not the group I'd have chosen. Third group, 18 milliliters of vinegar 3 times a day. Fourth group, half a pint of seawater. which just sounds absolutely horrible, doesn't it, to think about? Imagine day 13, 14 rolling around. You've got to get another half pint of seawater down you.
It would seem like that might create a few other problems.
You might think. Group 5 got 2 oranges and a lemon each day. And by the way, that didn't last the whole 2 weeks because supplies ran out. And group 6, which I think probably he thought was where some of his interest might come from, group 6 got this paste of garlic and mustard seed and radish root and what was called gum myrrh. Maybe you know what that is and I don't. But anyway, so those are the 6 groups. And as you will have guessed, those who got the citrus fruits experienced the most sudden and good visible effects, even though they ran out of fruit. One of the sailors who was in that group was fit for duty afterwards, and the other one was basically almost recovered. And of course, the others were in no great shape, ×5 in their groups. And the point is, it took time for those lessons to be accepted. But in due course, lemon juice and lime juice, hello from a limey, lemon juice and lime juice were issued routinely to all sailors in the British fleet. And Lind is recognized as the man in my country, as the man who pioneered comparing like with like and like with unlike. And his trials design informed what happened in our country and developed into clinical trials. So it's a record that we're proud of.
Well, I can't wait to hear from John about this, Alex, but I also can't help but ask, given the nature of our podcast, did the requirement to have citrus lead to any developments on, say, the alcoholic ration front for the British Navy?
You'll find a way to ask that question in every podcast. I don't know. I don't think they were putting citrus in their gin, although that would have been ahead of its time. And in fact, is what I'm drinking in honor of the citrus. I should ask you guys what you're drinking. But I'm having gin and tonic, gin for Plymouth's Gin Navy for the Navy, and the citrus in it is obvious. And I don't think it informed that, John, but I'm Bryan. But I would like to think that it didn't detract from the importance of drinking alcohol in our Navy.
Well, I want to circle back to that after John leaves. But John, what do you think about this quote unquote clinical trial on Salisbury?
Well, the Brits were pretty good. I mean, leadership in the development of scientific medicine passed from one country to another. Scotland in the 1700s and maybe a little bit very late 1600s was really a pretty good place.
Right. True.
Then you have, the experience you just detailed, and of course, John Snow with cholera.
Yes.
So yeah, the Brits have plenty to be proud of.
When you guys are in London one day, we will go to the John Snow pub, which is down the street from the pump that caused the cholera investigation that John Snow carried out.
Well, I was about to mention, Alex, and I don't know if this will inform our listeners on the way you and I roll when we're overseas, but I was going to mention you've already taken me there. I was
being nice to our guests. I was taking John is going to come.
But John, if you have not been, it's worth a pint there just to experience it. But John, one of the very pleasant surprises about your book is the degree to which it's not only a history of the pandemic, but also kind of a history and even a meditation on the evolution of science and medicine in the United States and Europe. And when you begin your story, all the action really was in Germany, France, and I guess possibly the UK, right?
Right. I mean, for roughly 2,000 years, logic had driven medical practice. And logic in and of itself, I mean, that's only a tool. That's why they were still bleeding patients as a treatment in the 1800s.
Right.
Then the French started correlating treatments with outcomes and realized it didn't make any sense. That was in the early 1800s. There is actually, I don't want to spend all our time as to why logic suggested that bleeding would work. You had the theory about humors, and that phrase remains
right.
alive, humoral immunity. But there was a lot of conditions that bleeding actually relieved some symptoms, and people tended to quite often would feel somewhat euphoric after being bled. Anyway, one of my favorite lines of my own in the book was that, something to the effect of, if you don't test your hypothesis in science, progress is coincidental.
Yeah.
If you do test your hypothesis, it's inevitable.
Yeah.
I somewhat, take exception to this idea, that there are mindsets that freeze things. It's progress moves sort of like an amoeba. You get, a little part of the body moves in one direction and then sort of the whole body shifts. But all of that comes because of hypotheses being tested, not because that there was some lock set that in your mind was frozen and then suddenly shifted. That's why your mind shifts.
Yeah. And John, a number of scientists that I greatly respect, including Alex, a couple at one of the companies we work with, have said to me that, in their opinion, a true scientist always has the mindset that they are going to be inevitably and constantly wrong. And that whatever they're concluding in 2022 likely will be overturned or augmented or changed in 10, 20, 50, 100 years. And that's fine. That's the nature of the beast. You have to just go with that if you're going to be in experimental science.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. And again, this idea that paradigms control things, they do and they don't. I mean, much more important, as I just was saying, is the, running experiments, testing what you're thinking, and moving forward. That's what creates a paradigm shift.
And John, you've been on. You've done so much media in the course of this pandemic, and you've got so many insights about it. Has this pandemic that we've endured and gone through, the COVID time, has that been a paradigm shift in the nature of transmission, because we're so much more mobile as a population, or is COVID actually another iteration of something? I'm not comparing it directly to the flu, but is it another iteration of things that visits mankind from time to time, and nothing in the world is new? Is it, or something in between those?
No, I would say it's nothing in the world is new.
Right.
A lot of people have talked about worldwide spread and airplanes and so forth. And yes, that's absolutely true that things move more quickly now in a matter of hours. But you had pandemics moving worldwide before air travel, and for that matter, before steam travel. When it took weeks to cross the ocean, you still had influenza pandemics moving from Europe to the Americas. And, it wasn't as deadly to the Native Americans as smallpox, but it was pretty deadly, because when you get a virus in a virgin population, one that has never seen that virus before, it is much deadlier than it is in a population that has been exposed to it.
Yes, absolutely.
You're always going to get some cross protection.
And to that exact point, John, it's been suggested to me that there likely are remains of Neanderthals in the Arctic ice cap that contain potentially viruses and bacteria and toxins that no human has encountered for 80,000 years. And that if those bodies thaw out and we're not careful, COVID-19 will look like a lame dress rehearsal. What do you think about that theory?
Well, I think it's reasonable that there were pathogens that infected people or Neanderthals, cousins, that are not around today. But I'm not particularly concerned that thawing a body out would release a pathogen that was capable of infecting us.
You think the 80,000 years of being frozen probably killed it?
Well, remember, they're not alive. But yeah, I mean, most viruses are pretty fragile.
Well, that's good. I'm not withdrawing my screenplay idea based on that. From
No, it sounded like a good pitch. I'll give you that. As we are, Bryan has opened the levees on how absurd we can be asking an expert question. So
Fair.
I'm gonna not feel too dumb asking mine, which is watching from outside your country, John and Bryan. I was surprised by the position taken by Dr. Fauci, who argued at one point that if you disagreed with him or if you attacked him, even, not that I'm saying anyone should attack him in any way, but if people attacked him, then they were attacking science. And it seemed to me that identification of the discipline with the man was quite antithetical to the position with which I agree, John, the position you were setting out, that one should test theories and run hypotheses to challenges and so forth. I wonder what you thought of that.
Well, I think it was more that people who were attacking him were attacking science.
Right, but
they were not.
Right,
they were not making analytical judgments on what he may or may not have been incorrect on. They were throwing everything out.
Sure, but for me, it goes too far to say that if you attack me, you're attacking the entire discipline of my.
I don't think you'd have to give me a quote from him. I don't think he ever did go that far.
One of the things I will say, John and Alex, that I think was a very serious communications mistake that at least our government made, honestly, both in the Trump and the Biden administrations, and I do to some extent hold Dr. Fauci and others responsible for this, is an excess of certitude. I would have loved to have seen Dr. Fauci come out much more forcefully than he did at the beginning to say, listen, science is a messy process. This is a brand new virus. By definition, we are going to be wrong, and facts on the ground are going to change. However, in March of 2020, the best advice we can give you based on what we know right now today is mask up. I think that would have made it much easier to later say, here's why you don't need to mask up anymore. But there was, I get it. You want to make the population feel like their government knows what they're doing. But I think we were too certain at the beginning.
I agree absolutely with your comment about how you frame things. And, I've been saying the same thing and given a lot of interviews on the, 2-year anniversary and so forth. If they had gone out and created an infrastructure in which error was allowed and to be expected, then you wouldn't have gotten a lot of the resistance that you got.
Yeah.
Specifically on the mask issue, they had reasons, some of which were data-driven, why they felt masking at the beginning was not necessary, even though obviously that was a mistake. But more important is framing the whole message at the beginning. We are in a war, the fog of war. We're giving you the best advice we can possibly give you at this moment, but there's a reasonable chance some of it will change.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to that point, John, the 2018 afterword in your book, to me, eerily predicts many of the reactions of governmental and scientific leaders and ordinary citizens to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you did some great early op-eds at the beginning telling us what we should expect and making recommendations. So in hindsight, pretending for the sake of argument that we're past the COVID-19 pandemic, how did we all do collectively? What, to quote Alex, lessons from history have we learned and not learned?
Well, first, I've written 5 afterwards, including one that I'm not sure it's been released yet, but it's already dated. But one thing that was constant in all of them was the last couple of pages in the afterword, which is the part I think you're referring to. I think this experience has confirmed what I was saying, the number one lesson from 1918, that is to tell the truth.
Yeah.
You don't, and people die because of it. And this time, 1918 was a little different. every European country, not every, Switzerland, Spain, and so forth, weren't at war. But, we were at war. The government lied because they felt that it would hurt morale to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, they said this is ordinary influenza by another name. It's called Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm.
Yet people were dying sometimes 24 hours after the first symptoms, and they were dying with horrific symptoms.
Unlike the normal flu.
Absolutely. And, young people were dying. People under 10, most vulnerable. Next peak of age 28 was a peak for deaths. Huge numbers of people were dying in those demographics.
Mm-hmm.
Studies of pregnant women, 21% to 71% case mortality.
Wow.
So it was, and people knew that they were being lied to. And what that did was create a kind of chaos and, of course, a lot of fear.
Yeah.
This time around was different. This time around, you got I think a large majority of the population that believes Tony Fauci and should, but you have a minority, and not a tiny minority, that believes something entirely different. But they believe. So you've got two sets of beliefs.
Right.
Only one of them is true. But people were operating based on those belief systems. And, again, the truth saves lives in a pandemic. Another lesson from 1918, which has been confirmed this time around, is that so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions work. They work.
Meaning masking and distancing.
Yeah, the social distancing, the masking, stuff like that. They actually do save not just some lives, but a lot of lives. By the same token, as China is discovering, you can't do that stuff forever. Personally, I don't see how China can possibly contain this virus. If they do manage to contain it somehow in urban areas, they'll only do that by rolling closures, which is going to screw up the supply chain because they'll be closing down factory towns one at a time. And then you have 600 million rural Chinese. How are you going to shut down those areas of the country? It can't be done. So I think, the virus is going to get out there in China. It is out there now, and I think things will go south there.
Well, speaking of China, John, and hate to put you on the spot a little bit, but in one of the afterwards, you stated regarding the 2003 SARS epidemic that, and I'm quoting now, the world was put at risk by China, which initially lied and hid the disease. China's candor has improved significantly, close quote. So as we say in the Congress, would you like to revise and extend your remarks on this subject?
Well, no, actually, China's candor has improved significantly.
Well, that says a lot about where it was in 2003 then.
Yeah, it does. During the, if you all remember bird flu, H5N1 and so forth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is still out there and could still cause a very lethal pandemic that would dwarf SARS-CoV-2. China has been pretty cooperative on those influenza viruses. And they had gotten a lot better. CDC had people in there. They helped create surveillance systems, things like that. And China obviously has not performed well in terms of searching for the origins. But the reality is, I would dispute those who think that China has, let's say, what would China have done? Do you think if they had released the genetic information 10 days earlier, it would have had any impact on the course of the pandemic?
No, I don't think that's that's the part that I don't think people get most upset about the situation in China. It's stymieing investigations as to the origin.
Yeah, I agree with that. So it's extremely irritating.
Right.
But I don't think anybody with a brain thinks this was a bioweapon.
No, sure, but
And I know, and whether it was a lab accident,
right.
all the evidence that I know of suggests and points pretty strongly towards the fact that it was a naturally occurring event. The only suggestion as to why it might be a lab accident is because they're hiding information.
Right.
Well, John, also the fact that the lab was 12 kilometers from the wet market.
Well, that's not very compelling, but there are coincidences in the world.
No, sure. I didn't see it being about coincidence. And you, of course, know, John, a great deal more about this than me, but that's never stopped me. I did see quite significant reporting from outlets that I trust, both in your country and in mine, that went some way to suggest some connection between experiments or research that was being undertaken in that laboratory and the resultant strains that we've seen.
Yeah, there is an argument that has been made, obviously, but the more research that has come out, the more it looks like a natural event. In fact, Michael Warby, I was one of the leading signers of many signatories of scientists who said the lab leak has to be at least looked at seriously. He's done more work and he's convinced himself otherwise. I think if there's something to be faulting the Chinese for, is those wet markets and not protecting the world's population from the wet market,
which were identified at least as far back as 2003 as a potential problem, right?
Exactly.
Would you help our listeners, because not everyone's would you help people to understand exactly what a wet market is?
Well, they have all sorts of animals stacked in cages, defecating and urinating on each other, and they're butchered live. There's blood everywhere. It's a perfect place to allow a pathogen to jump species.
Sounds absolutely horrible.
So, John, what about this notion? And you said a minute ago that the 10-day delay, or let's even say it was 30-day delay in notifying the world, how much difference would it make? Do you buy this notion that they, in part, delayed that so they could hoard PPE?
No. I think the local politicians were afraid of the national politicians. Mm-hmm. They were covering their ass.
So you're saying they withheld information, but not by national policy?
Well, there certainly was some national policy. But initially, this is the same thing that happened in SARS, which has been looked at in the original SARS, mm-hmm. looked at in great detail.
Right.
And I'm not an expert on what happened with China. I'm probably wasting your time and your listeners' time.
Hey, we do that all along, John. Waste our listeners.
But the reality is, here's what happened. The world was warned about this in January. What did it do for the next 2 months?
Yeah.
Suppose it had been warned 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah.
What would it have done?
That's a fair point. Do you care to weigh in on grading the Trump versus Biden administration's response?
Yeah, Trump deserves credit for warp speed. It wasn't his idea, but he could have said no. So on that, I'd give him, it was pretty obvious. It would have been hard to say no, but he didn't have to say yes. So I give him a 7.8 on that decision and a minus 10 on everything else.
Yeah. You're like the East German judge from the Olympics back in the day. The other question I have for you related to this, John, is one of the best parts of your book to me was this discussion of, in the late, 19th century, the difference between the way Americans viewed medical education and science in general, and the way the Germans and the French and others in Europe viewed it. And at the time, obviously, they were way ahead of us. It was before, as you chronicle quite well, the founding of Johns Hopkins. And as you mentioned in the book, a lot of American medical schools, maybe all of them, didn't even require a college degree. So fast forward now a couple centuries. How are we doing in terms of scientific cooperation across the pond? And a great example would be the Pfizer-BioNTech collaboration on the COVID-19 vaccine. Not that we should compare ourselves to 225 years ago, but is there more we should be doing globally to cooperate?
Well, I think right now we're probably doing it. And Ashish Jha who's just took over as the chief coordinator for COVID-19, has been a long time advocate of that. Mm-hmm. So he'd be pushing for even more. You can make an argument about transferring the intellectual property from Moderna which was largely developed at NIH anyway, to the developing world. But just doing that is not going to really help them make the vaccines. There's so much more involved. But I think basically right now, I think the Biden administration should get at least if you're grading very hard, a B-. Mm-hmm. If grading easily and maybe even an A, certainly an A- on worldwide cooperation. I think one of the striking things that happened in this pandemic was the amount of interdisciplinary research. And I mean, every scientist in every field tried to get together and make some contribution. It was absolutely amazing. I don't know that those things turned out to be that productive, but the cross-fertilization, I mean, that was really extraordinary. Physicists, yep. And I'm not talking about biophysicists, I'm talking about physicists, right. Getting together with chemists and epidemiologists and trying to make some contribution.
Well, yeah.
So
I was just going to say, John, wearing my hat as the executive director of UC Irvine Cybersecurity Institute, it is really like whatever's worse than pulling teeth, if you've seen The Marathon Man, to get a computer scientist and a physical scientist and an engineer to cooperate on anything. So I completely agree with that. The degree of multidisciplinary, multinational cooperation, it's almost like a giant informal Manhattan Project.
Yeah, and that was boots on the ground level.
Yeah,
that was individual scientists just gathering people around them. And
yeah, exactly. Well, look, this has been fantastic. Your book is great. You're great. I appreciate you being on. Alex, do you have any other questions for John, or John, anything you want us to ask you?
It's been fascinating listening to you, and I'm grateful to you and indeed for the work that you have done. But I suppose my question, do you feel that the public communication of science is something that has improved over this process, gotten worse? Do you think we're going to see more people want to be scientists as a result of, or be epidemiologists, or going into medicine as a result of what we've lived through?
Great question.
I think all of the above.
Right. Okay.
The single biggest failure of the Biden administration has been in messaging.
Yep.
They also could have taken Delta more seriously and had more tests, so there are some concrete steps or missteps. But I think the biggest misstep was not coordinating their messaging. I think maybe they wanted the scientists, leave the scientists alone, don't intervene, but you got to coordinate what you're saying. And so that hasn't helped, but I certainly think people have been inspired, both by what healthcare workers have done and what the scientific community has done. And then you've got the crazies out there, like someone in my family who's told me that I sold out to the global elite and that that Gates and the global elite are trying to depopulate the world using the vaccine to kill everybody. Now, I was extremely insulted by being told I had sold out to the global elite. I would like to have thought I was part of it.
You were already in it. That's outrageous.
As Seinfeld
Maybe
said, I'm
not
out. I was never in.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe not financially, but still, I would, But I wrote her back and said, well, why would they try to depopulate the world? Because that would cut down on the number of children whose blood they could drink.
But let's bear in mind that the world population has been remorselessly going up throughout this period of time. I do not dispute, of course, how appalling and horrible it must be to have long COVID, or to have relatives who've suffered very badly from COVID, or heaven forbid died. But the mortality rate from COVID has not put a dent in the remorseless population growth in our world. So that's one for the birds, even on the merits, because it hasn't diminished world population really at all.
Well, and also
You're talking about logic. Come on.
Sorry about that.
Well, and also I'm going to beat this drum I seem to be beating every week now, which is I wish the same people that are critiquing you and the Western world on something like that would recognize and speak out about the literal depopulation that's going on as we speak in Ukraine.
Yes.
But it never seems to be balanced. It's always against the country they live in. But that's a question for another day. So, John, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Everybody should buy John's book. I will tell you, it's a little bit delayed on Amazon because it's so popular, but look in our show notes and get it. And John, thank you so much. And the blessing and the curse of being on this show is we'll probably have you back again if you're willing.
Great guest.
Okay, it was a lot of fun, and maybe one day we will meet in person.
I hope so. At the Jon Snow.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you next time. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for topics, you can find us on Twitter or on our website, hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com. We look forward to joining you next time.
We thank our gifted producers, Jeremy Core and Kate Cruz, and our visionary executive producer, Ivan Williams, without whom this podcast would be, well, history. And thanks also to our art designer, David Wardle.
Cheers.